cruel female CEO despised orphans and banned them from her company, until desperate 6-year-olds showed up for job interview to pay her dying father's medical bills. What she discovered will break you. The 42nd floor of the Williams Tower pierced the Manhattan skyline like a steel dagger, and from behind the floor-to-ceiling windows of the corner office, Catherine Williams surveyed her empire with the cold satisfaction of a conquering general. At 40, she had built a billion-dollar corporation through sheer ruthlessness, crushing competitors and dismissing employees without a flicker of remorse. "Mrs. Williams," the quarterly reports, her assistant Jennifer whispered, placing thick folders on the mahogany desk with trembling hands. Catherine didn't look up from her computer screen, where green numbers climbed steadily upward, her net worth increasing by the minute. "Profits up 18%, Catherine murmured, her manicured fingers dancing across the keyboard. "Good. Schedule terminations for the marketing department. We're overstaffed." Jennifer's face paled. "All of them, ma'am?" "That's 47. People right before the holidays." Catherine's arctic blue eyes finally lifted, freezing Jennifer mid-sentence. Did I stutter? 47 families will learn the meaning of efficiency today. That's business. The snowflakes outside began their gentle descent, coating the city in deceptive purity. Catherine's penthouse apartment awaited her 15,000 square feet of marble and emptiness, where she dined alone every night on meals prepared by a chef she'd never bothered to thank. She remembered the exact moment her heart had crystallized into ice. At 12, she'd begged her parents to help a homeless family she'd seen shivering on Fifth Avenue. Her mother Victoria's cruel laughter still echoed. "Charity is for the weak, Catherine. The poor stay poor because they choose to. We stay rich because we're smarter, stronger, better." That lesson had shaped every decision since. When her college boyfriend, James Parker, had dreamed of social work instead of stock portfolios, she discarded him like a failed investment. When employees struggled with medical bills, she'd eliminated their positions to cut costs. When her own conscience had whispered protests, she'd silenced it with champagne and designer clothes. Now, examining her reflection in the window's glass, Catherine saw exactly what her mother had crafted, a woman who measured worth in dollars and viewed human suffering as market inefficiency. Her intercom crackled. "Mrs. Williams, building security reports an unauthorized person heading to the executive floor. A child, ma'am." Catherine's jaw tightened. "Remove them immediately." But as she straightened her Armani blazer and prepared for another afternoon of calculated cruelty, Catherine Williams had no idea that a 7-year-old girl with nothing left to lose was climbing 42 flights of stairs to shatter her perfectly ordered world forever. The elevator dinged softly, and Catherine's empire trembled on its foundation. Grace. Parker's small sneakers squeaked against the polished marble floors as she clutched a crumpled piece of paper to her chest. At 7 years old, she barely reached the reception desk's edge, but her determination towered over every adult in the gleaming lobby of Williams Tower. "Sweetie, you can't be here alone," the security guard had said downstairs, but Grace had slipped past him during a delivery distraction. 42 flights of stairs later, her legs ached and her breath came in short puffs, but she pressed forward with the fierce resolve of a child who'd already lost everything that mattered. The executive floor stretched before her like a cathedral of power crystal chandeliers, oil paintings worth more than most people's homes, and the suffocating silence of serious money. Grace's worn pink coat, patched at the elbows by her dying father's unsteady hands, looked painfully out of place among the luxury. "Excuse me, little girl," Jennifer started, rising from her desk as Grace marched past. "I need to see the boss." "Lady," Grace announced, her voice carrying the startling authority of desperation, "I have a resume." She held up her paper-lined notebook sheets covered in careful 7-year-old handwriting. Under experience, she'd written, taking care of Daddy when he's sick, making sandwiches, being brave when scary things happen. Jennifer's heart clenched, but protocol was protocol. "Honey, you need an appointment." Grace pushed past her with surprising strength and burst through Catherine's office doors like a small hurricane. The billionaire looked up from her computer, her face transforming from mild annoyance to thunderous. Rage in seconds. "What is the meaning of this?" Catherine's voice could have frozen fire. Grace stood straighter, clutching her homemade resume. "My name is Grace Parker, and I need a job." Her voice wavered slightly, but she continued. "My daddy is very sick, and we don't have money for the medicine. I can work hard. I know how to clean and make things neat." Catherine stared at this tiny intruder who'd breached her fortress of solitude. The child's blonde hair was neatly braided despite its obvious need for professional styling. Her blue eyes held a maturity that no 7-year-old should possess the weight of adult worries. In a face that should know only playground concerns. "Security," Catherine barked into her intercom. "Please don't call them," Grace pleaded, stepping closer to the massive desk. "I walked really far to get here. Daddy says you're the most important person in the whole city. He says important people can fix anything." Something flickered in Catherine's chest, a sensation she hadn't felt in decades. She pushed it down ruthlessly. "Children don't work in my company," Catherine said coldly. "Now leave before." "My daddy is dying," Grace interrupted, her small voice carrying devastating simplicity. "The doctors say he needs an operation, but we don't have enough money. I thought maybe if I worked really hard for you, you could help us save him." The words hung in the air like snowflakes, delicate, pure, and somehow capable of changing everything they touched. "My daddy's name is James Parker," Grace said, digging into her coat pocket. "I brought his picture so you'd know I'm telling the truth." The photograph slipped from Grace's small fingers and fluttered onto Catherine's mahogany desk like a fallen leaf. Catherine's world tilted off its axis as she stared at the image. James, thinner and older, but unmistakably the man who'd once held her heart in his gentle hands. The room seemed to spin. 10 years collapsed into seconds as memories crashed over Catherine like a merciless tide. James laughing in their tiny apartment, his arms wrapped around her as they planned their future. James proposing with a simple ring he'd saved months to buy. James's face crumbling when she'd chosen her inheritance over their love. "Daddy always talks about someone named Catherine," Grace continued innocently, unaware that she'd just detonated an emotional bomb. "He gets really sad when he says that name. Were you friends with my daddy?" Catherine's throat constricted. Friends. If only it had been that simple. Choose Catherine? Choose us or choose the money. But you can't have both. James is desperate. Words from a decade ago echoed in her mind. She'd been 29, standing at the crossroads between love and empire. Her mother Victoria had made it clear marry James and lose her inheritance, or break his heart and claim her destiny. She'd chosen the money. God help her, she'd chosen the money. "Mrs. Williams?" Grace's small voice pulled Catherine back to the present. "Are you okay? You look like you're going to cry." Catherine forced her expression back to stone, but inside, her carefully constructed walls crumbled brick by brick. "Tell me about your father's illness," she managed, her voice barely steady. Grace's face brightened at the interest. "He has something called pancreatic cancer. The doctors say it's really bad, but if he gets the special operation, maybe he can get better. He tries to hide when he's in pain, but I know because he holds his tummy and makes little noises." Each word was a knife, twisting in Catherine's chest. James, beautiful, kind James who dreamed of becoming a social worker, who'd wanted to spend his life helping broken families, was dying alone while she counted money in her tower. "Mommy died when I was 2. Grace continued matter-of-factly. Daddy says she was an angel who came to Earth just long enough to bring me to him. Now it's just us, but the medical bills took all our money. We had to sell our house and our car, and even Mommy's ring. Catherine's hands trembled as she picked up James's photograph. He looked exactly like the man she'd fallen in love with. Gentle eyes, kind smile, the same stubborn cowlick that refused to stay down. But there was something new in his expression. The profound sadness of a man who'd learned that sometimes love isn't enough. "Where is your father now?" Catherine whispered. "St. Mary's Hospital, room 304. He doesn't know I came here. He says asking rich people for help is begging, and Parkers don't beg. But I think saving Daddy is more important than pride." The irony struck Catherine like lightning. She'd built an empire on the foundation of James's broken heart, and now his daughter, their daughter in every way that mattered, stood before her, offering Catherine a chance at redemption she didn't deserve. Ultimate question crystallized with terrifying clarity. Would she choose love this time? Or would she let the only man she'd ever truly loved die while she counted profits? "Get out," Catherine whispered, her voice barely audible. The photograph of James trembled in her hands as 10 years of buried guilt erupted like a volcano. "Get out now." Grace's small face crumpled with confusion and hurt. "But Mrs. Williams, I haven't finished explaining." "I said get out." Catherine exploded, her voice echoing off the glass walls. Grace stumbled backward, tears welling in her bright blue eyes that looked heartbreakingly familiar. Though Catherine couldn't place why, security guards appeared within seconds, their hands gentle but firm, as they guided the sobbing child toward the elevator. "Please," Grace called over their shoulders. "I'll work for free. I just want my daddy to live." The office door slammed shut, leaving Catherine alone with the deafening silence of her gilded prison. She stared at James's photograph until her vision blurred, her perfectly manicured nails digging crescents into her palms. 20 minutes passed before she could move. 30 before she could think. An hour before she could reach for her phone with hands that shook like autumn leaves. "Marcus," she barked to her head of security, "I need everything you can find on James Parker. St. Mary's Hospital, room 304. I need it in 1 hour." "Ma'am, that's the same man from the child's." 1 hour, Marcus, not a minute longer." Catherine paced her office like a caged panther, each step echoing her mounting dread. When Marcus returned with a thick folder, his expression was grave. "Ma'am, it's not good news." The medical records painted a picture of devastating decline. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. Without immediate surgery costing $300,000, James had perhaps weeks to live. The financial documents were even more heartbreaking. A man who'd sold everything, borrowed against nothing he had left, all to buy a few more months with his daughter. His wife? Catherine asked, though something deep in her soul already knew. The answer: Sarah Parker died 3 years ago in a car accident. She was a nurse, rushing to help victims of a multi-car pileup when her vehicle was struck. The child, Grace, was in the car, but survived with minor injuries. Catherine's world lurched sideways. Grace wasn't James's biological daughter. She was the child of the woman he'd loved after Catherine had destroyed him. Yet he'd raised her as his own, pouring all the love Catherine had rejected into this bright, brave little girl. The irony was suffocating. Catherine had chosen money over love, believing she was securing her future. James had chosen love over everything, and now he was dying because he couldn't afford to live. Her intercom buzzed. "Mrs. Williams, your mother is on line 1. She says it's urgent." Victoria's voice dripped venom through the speaker. "Catherine, darling, I heard about your little visitor today. Surely you're not thinking of involving yourself with that man." "Again? How did you—" "I have eyes everywhere, dear. Just as I did 10 years ago, when I saved you from making the biggest mistake of your life. James Parker is a nobody who would have dragged you down to his level. You chose wisely then. Choose wisely now." Catherine stared at the medical reports, at the photograph of the man she'd never stopped loving, at the stack of termination notices for 47 employees who would lose their jobs before Christmas. For 40 years, she'd been her mother's puppet, dancing to the tune of profit and prestige. But Grace Parker, 7 years old and braver than any CEO Catherine had ever known, had walked into her fortress and shown her what true courage looked like. Catherine stood slowly, her decision crystallizing like ice forming on a winter window. "Marcus," she called, her voice steady for the first time in hours. "Prepare my car. I'm going to St. Mary's Hospital." The choice that would define the rest of her life had been made by a child's tears and a dying man's love. St. Mary's Hospital assaulted. Catherine's senses the moment she stepped through its sliding doors. The harsh fluorescent lighting, the smell of disinfectant mixed with despair, the constant symphony of beeping machines and muffled sobs. It was a universe away from her sanitized world of marble and mahogany. Catherine's Louboutin heels clicked against the worn linoleum as she navigated corridors that seemed designed to strip away hope. Room 304 was in the charity ward, where the walls were painted institutional green and the heating barely functioned. She found the room and froze in the doorway, her hand gripping the frame for support. James lay unconscious on a narrow hospital bed, his once strong frame reduced to sharp angles beneath thin blankets. Tubes snaked from his arms, and machines monitored his fading life with electronic precision. The man who'd once lifted her effortlessly in his arms now looked as fragile as spun glass, but it was the small figure curled in the plastic chair beside his bed that shattered Catherine's remaining composure. Grace had changed from her pink coat into a faded sweater too large for her tiny frame. Her blonde hair had escaped its careful braids, and she held her father's hand with both of hers, whispering stories to his unconscious form. And then the princess realized she'd been mean to everyone because she was scared, Grace murmured, her voice barely audible. But it wasn't too late to say sorry. "It's never too late to say sorry, right, Daddy?" Catherine pressed herself against the corridor wall, her heart hammering against her ribs. Through the window, she watched Grace gently smooth James's hair, the gesture so tender and protective that it belonged to a mother, not a 7-year-old child. "The nurse says you're fighting really hard," Grace continued. "She says fighters sometimes need extra help, but we don't have money for extra help. I went to see a lady today who has lots of money, but she was scary and yelled at me." Catherine's reflection stared back at her from the window, a woman in a $3,000 coat observing the wreckage of her past selfishness. She'd done this. Her choices had led to this moment. James dying in a charity ward while his daughter told fairy tales to keep hope alive. A nurse approached Grace with practiced kindness. "Sweetie, visiting hours end in 30 minutes. Do you want me to call your aunt to pick you up? Can I stay a little longer? I think Daddy can hear me when I read to him." "Of course, honey. But you need to eat something. When did you last have a meal?" Grace's stomach answered with a loud rumble. "Yesterday morning, I think. But I'm not hungry." Catherine's chest tightened as she watched the nurse slip Grace a granola bar from her pocket, an act of kindness that should have been unnecessary. If Catherine had chosen differently a decade ago, She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers, scrolling to a contact she hadn't called in years. Dr. Richards? This is Catherine Williams. I need the best oncology team in the city transferred to St. Mary's Hospital immediately. Yes, I understand the cost. Room 304. Tonight. As she ended the call, Grace's voice drifted through the door. I made a wish today, Daddy. I wished that someone would help us. Do you think wishes come true? Catherine stepped closer to the window, and for one heartbreaking moment, her eyes met Grace's through the glass. The little girl's face lit up with recognition and hope, but Catherine couldn't face that hope. Not yet. Not until she found a way to earn the forgiveness she didn't deserve. She turned and walked away, leaving behind the ghost of the man she'd loved and the child who might teach her how to love again. Behind her, Grace pressed her face to the window, watching the elegant stranger disappear into the shadows. Victoria Williams swept into Catherine's penthouse like an Arctic storm, her silver hair perfectly coiffed despite the midnight hour. Behind her, Robert Williams straightened his designer tie with the predatory smile of a shark sensing blood in the water. 48 hours, Catherine, Victoria announced without preamble, her voice sharp enough to cut crystal. 48 hours since you made the most catastrophic mistake of your adult life. Catherine didn't look up from her laptop or medical. Reports and financial statements painted a grim picture of James's condition. The best oncology team in New York was now attending to him, but even they couldn't guarantee success. I don't know what you're talking about, Mother. Robert laughed coldly, pulling out his phone to display photographs taken by private investigators. St. Mary's Hospital. 3 visits in 2 days. $250,000 transferred to their oncology department. Shall I continue? Victoria circled Catherine's living room like a predator stalking wounded prey. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? I've had that man under surveillance for 10 years, waiting for the day he might resurface in your life. Catherine's blood turned to ice. You've been watching James? Of course, darling. James Parker, failed social worker turned handyman. Widowed. Father struggling to raise a child that isn't even his blood. A pathetic creature who never recovered from your wise decision to choose prosperity over poverty. Grace is his daughter in every way that matters, Catherine snapped, her control finally cracking. Grace, Victoria spat the name like poison, is the bastard child of a dead nurse. A financial burden that James took on out of misguided sentiment, just like he would have been a burden to you. Robert moved to the window, gazing out at the Manhattan skyline that sparkled like scattered diamonds. The board of directors received an interesting call today, Catherine. Apparently, our CEO has been making unauthorized charitable donations. They're concerned about your mental stability. Catherine's laptop screen displayed the latest medical update. James's condition had stabilized, but he remained unconscious. Grace hadn't left his bedside, except when the nurses insisted. There's more, Victoria continued. Producing a legal document with theatrical flourish. A preliminary injunction to remove the child from the hospital environment. Apparently, someone filed a complaint suggesting that Grace Parker is being exploited by opportunistic individuals. You didn't. Oh, but I did. By tomorrow morning, that little girl will be in protective custody while the courts determine her fitness for placement. Far away from dying fathers and misguided billionaires. Catherine stood so abruptly that her chair toppled backward. You stay away from Grace. Or what? Robert's voice dripped with amusement. You'll choose poverty again? You'll throw away 40 years of building this empire for a man who couldn't even afford his own medical care? Victoria approached her daughter with the calculated precision of a chess master, delivering checkmate. Here's what's going to happen, Catherine. You will immediately cease all contact with James Parker and his ward. You will release a statement explaining that your recent charitable contributions were made in error due to temporary emotional distress. And you will focus on what actually matters, the Williams legacy. And if I refuse, then you lose everything. The company, the trust fund, the penthouse, even the Williams name. I'll have you declared mentally incompetent and stripped of every asset you've ever controlled. You'll have nothing to offer James Parker except the love that already killed him once. Catherine's reflection stared back at her from the darkened window eye, woman standing at the same crossroads where she'd failed 10 years ago. But this time, the stakes weren't just her heart. This time, a 7-year-old girl's future hung in the balance. You have 24 hours to decide, Victoria said, gathering her coat with imperial authority. Choose wisely, darling. Some mistakes can't be undone twice. As the door closed behind them, Catherine sank to her knees on the marble floor, finally understanding the true cost of the empire she'd built on the ashes of love. The war for her soul had begun. Catherine arrived at St. Mary's Hospital the next morning carrying 3 cups of coffee and a child's hot chocolate, her hands trembling slightly as she approached room 304. She'd spent the sleepless night wrestling with Victoria's ultimatum, but seeing Grace curled in that uncomfortable chair again made her decision crystal clear. You came back, Grace whispered, her eyes wide with surprise and cautious hope. Dark circles shadowed her young face, and her clothes were wrinkled from sleeping in the hospital chair. I brought you hot chocolate, Catherine said awkwardly, extending the cup. She'd never spoken to a child with genuine affection. Every interaction in her adult life had been calculated, measured, strategic. Grace accepted the drink with both small hands, inhaling the sweet steam. It smells like Christmas morning. Daddy and I haven't had Christmas morning in a long time. Catherine settled into the second chair, studying James's peaceful face. The medical team had worked miracles overnight. His color was better, his breathing stronger. Hope was a dangerous emotion, but Catherine found herself embracing it anyway. Tell me about your daddy, Catherine said softly, surprising herself with the gentleness in her voice. Grace's face brightened like sunrise. He's the best daddy in the whole world. He makes funny voices when he reads stories, and he taught me to ride a bike, even though we had to sell it later. When Mommy died, he cried every night, but he always made sure I didn't see. Catherine's throat tightened. You remember your mother? A little bit. She had yellow hair like mine, and she sang songs about angels. Daddy says she was rushing to help people when the accident happened. He says helping people was more important to her than being safe. The irony wasn't lost on Catherine. James had loved a woman who embodied everything Catherine had rejected, someone who put others before herself, even unto death. Daddy gets sad sometimes, Grace continued, sipping her hot chocolate, especially when he looks at old pictures. There's one picture he keeps hidden in his wallet, a lady with dark hair who looks really pretty. But whenever I ask about her, he just says she was someone he knew a long time ago. Catherine's heart stopped. After all these years, James still carried her photograph. The nurses say you're paying for Daddy's medicine, Grace said suddenly, her blue eyes studying Catherine with uncomfortable intensity. Why would you help people you don't even know? Catherine struggled for an answer that wouldn't reveal too much. Sometimes adults make mistakes. Big mistakes that hurt people they care about. And sometimes, if they're very lucky, they get a chance to fix those mistakes. Grace nodded solemnly, as if this explanation made perfect sense to her 7-year-old wisdom. Daddy says everyone deserves a second chance, even people who do bad things. Your daddy is a very wise man. Are you lonely? Grace asked with a devastating directness that only children possess. You seem lonely, like you've forgotten how to smile. Catherine's carefully constructed walls crumbled a little more. No one had asked her about loneliness in decades. No one had cared enough to notice. Ah, yes, I suppose I am lonely. Grace reached over and patted Catherine's hand with sticky fingers. It's okay. Daddy and I get lonely too. But we're less lonely when we're together. Maybe you could be less lonely if you stayed with us. Before Catherine could respond, James stirred in his bed, his eyelids fluttering. Both women leaned forward, hope and fear warring in their expressions. Grace? James's voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of infinite love. I'm here, Daddy, Grace said, gripping his hand. I'm here, and I brought a friend. James's eyes opened slowly, struggling to focus. When his gaze found Catherine's face, the recognition was immediate and devastating. Catherine, he breathed, his voice filled with wonder and disbelief. You're real. For a moment that lasted an eternity, 10 years of separation dissolved into nothing. Am I dreaming? James whispered, his voice raw from days of unconsciousness. His dark eyes, though clouded with medication and pain, held the same gentle intensity that had once made Catherine believe in forever. You're not dreaming, Daddy, Grace said, squeezing his hand with fierce determination. The pretty lady came back. She brought me hot chocolate and everything. James struggled to sit up, his movements careful and deliberate. Catherine fought every instinct to reach out and help him, knowing that her touch might shatter this fragile moment of reconnection. Catherine Williams, James said slowly, as if testing whether her name would make her disappear. In St. Mary's Hospital, with my daughter. Either I'm hallucinating, or the world has turned completely upside down. The world has definitely turned upside down, Catherine replied, her voice barely steady. The question is whether that's a good thing or a catastrophe. Grace looked between the two adults with the keen perception of a child who'd learned to read emotional undercurrents. Do you two know each other? You're looking at each other funny. James's laugh was weak, but genuine. We knew each other a long time ago, sweetheart. Before you were born. Before. He gestured vaguely at the hospital. Room, the machines, the evidence of his failing body. Dr. Martinez chose that moment to enter with a tablet full of test results. Mr. Parker, excellent news. Your response to the new treatment protocol has been remarkable. The tumor markers have dropped significantly, and your white blood cell count is improving. Catherine held her breath, afraid to hope. Does that mean Daddy's getting better? Grace asked, her small voice carrying the weight of desperate optimism. It means we're cautiously optimistic, Dr. Martinez smiled. The surgery we discussed is now a real possibility. If we can continue this improvement for another week, we'll schedule the procedure. After the doctor left, an awkward silence settled over the room. Grace had fallen asleep in her chair, exhausted by days of worry and the emotional roller coaster of seeing her father awake. She's remarkable, James said softly, watching his daughter's peaceful face. Sometimes I think she's the one taking care of me instead of the other way around. She loves you deeply, Catherine observed. It's written in every gesture, every word. Sarah was like that too. Fierce, protective, willing to sacrifice everything for the people she loved. James's eyes found Catherine's. You probably think I'm crazy. Raising another man's child is my own. I think you're the most honorable man I've ever known, Catherine said quietly. I always did. The words hung between them like a bridge across a decade of pain. James studied her face, searching for answers to questions he was afraid to ask. Why are you here, Catherine? And don't tell me it's coincidence. I know you well enough to recognize when you're orchestrating something. Catherine's phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. Final warning. Choose now or lose everything forever. But as she looked at James alive, improving, surrounded by love. Despite his poverty, Catherine realized she'd already made her choice. The only question now was whether she had the courage to follow through. I'm here because a 7-year-old girl taught me that some things are more valuable than money, Catherine said. And because I've spent 10 years regretting the worst decision I ever made. James's eyes softened with understanding and something that might have been forgiveness. Outside the window, snow began to fall again. But for the first time in years, it looked like hope instead of cold indifference. Catherine's phone exploded with notifications as she sat in the hospital cafeteria at dawn, nursing her third cup of coffee in 6 hours. Text after text from board members, lawyers, and business associates painted a picture of corporate chaos, orchestrated by her own family. Emergency board meeting called for 9 a.m. Concerns about your recent financial decisions. Questions regarding your mental fitness to lead. But the call that made her blood freeze came at 7:15 a.m. Miss Williams, this is Child Protective Services. We have a court order to remove Grace Parker from St. Mary's Hospital immediately. She's been placed in emergency protective custody pending a fitness hearing. Catherine's coffee cup shattered against the cafeteria floor. On what grounds? Concerns about her welfare. Anonymous reports suggest the child is being exploited by individuals seeking to manipulate a vulnerable situation for financial gain. Catherine was already running toward the elevator, her heels clicking like gunshots against the linoleum. Victoria had played her final card with ruthless precision. If Catherine wouldn't abandon James voluntarily, she'd ensure Grace was torn. Away from them both, Room 304 was in chaos when Catherine arrived. 2 social workers flanked Grace's chair while the security guard stood awkwardly by the door. Grace clutched her small teddy bear, tears streaming down her face as she looked desperately between her unconscious father and the strangers trying to separate them. I won't leave, Daddy, Grace sobbed. I won't. He needs me. Sweetie, this is temporary, one social worker said gently. We're going to take you somewhere safe while the adults figure things out. But Daddy is safe, and the pretty lady is helping us. Why can't I stay? Catherine burst through the door like an avenging angel. Stop this immediately. The lead social worker, a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Henderson, held up the court order. I'm sorry, but we have legal authority here. The child needs to be removed from this environment. What environment? A hospital where her father is receiving life-saving treatment? An environment where vulnerable people are being manipulated by wealthy individuals with ulterior motives. Catherine's phone rang. Victoria's voice dripped with false concern through the speaker. Oh dear, I hope Grace isn't too upset. Children are so resilient, though. She adjusts to foster care in no time. You did this, Catherine whispered, her voice deadly quiet. I protected our family from scandal and protected that child from your emotional instability. 2 birds, 1 stone. Grace broke free from the social workers and ran to Catherine, wrapping her small arms around Catherine's legs. Please don't let them take me. I promise I'll be good. I'll work really hard for you. Catherine knelt down, her heart shattering as she looked into Grace's terrified eyes. Listen to me, sweetheart. This isn't your fault. You've done nothing wrong. But why are they taking me away from Daddy? Behind them, James began to stir, the commotion filtering through his medicated sleep. His eyes opened just as the social workers gently but firmly lifted Grace away from Catherine. Grace? James struggled to sit up, his voice panic-stricken. What's happening? Where are you taking her? Daddy? Grace reached for him desperately as they carried her toward the door. Don't let them take me. I want to stay with you. James tried to climb out of bed, pulling at his 4 lines. You can't take her. She's all I have. Grace, the machines around? His bed began beeping frantically as his heart rate spiked. Nurses rushed in as James collapsed back onto the pillows, his face gray with exhaustion and terror. Daddy! Daddy! Grace's screams echoed down the corridor as they carried her away. Catherine stood frozen in the doorway, watching her world implode in real time. Through the chaos, her phone buzzed with one final message from Victoria. Choose wisely in the next hour, darling. This can all be reversed, for a price. The perfect storm had arrived, and Catherine stood at its eye, knowing that her next decision would determine whether love could finally triumph over the empire. Built on its ashes, James fought consciousness, like a drowning man refusing to surface. But Grace's terrified screams had burned themselves into his mind, dragging him back to a reality more painful than any cancer could deliver. His eyes opened to find Catherine standing frozen by his bedside, her face a mask of anguish and determination. Where is she? James's voice was raw, desperate. Where did they take Grace? Catherine moved closer, her usual composure shattered. Emergency protective custody. My family orchestrated this to force me away from you. They're using Grace as leverage. James struggled to sit up, his hands shaking as he reached for the call. Button. I have to get to her. She's never been away from me, not once since Sarah died. She'd be terrified. James, you can barely sit up. The stress nearly triggered another cardiac episode. If you push yourself now, I don't care. James's voice cracked with emotion. She's 7 years old, Catherine. 7. She's been taking care of me when it should be the other way around. And now she's alone with strangers, because someone decided to use her as a weapon against us. The word us hung in the air between them, loaded with 10 years of unfinished business and the desperate present circumstances. Catherine had spent a decade convincing herself that love was a luxury she couldn't afford. Now she watched it destroy the only man she'd ever truly loved, and she realized that all her wealth and power meant nothing if she couldn't protect the people who mattered. Tell me what happened between us, James said suddenly, his dark eyes searching her face. Not the sanitized version you probably tell yourself. The truth. All of it. Catherine sank into the chair Grace had occupied for days, her hands trembling, as she faced the confession she'd avoided for a decade. I chose money over love. I chose empire over happiness. I chose everything that didn't matter over the only thing that did. Your mother? My mother made it clear that loving you meant losing everything. The inheritance, the company, the family name. She said you would drag me down to mediocrity, that I was destined for greatness that you couldn't share. James closed his eyes, but tears leaked from beneath his lashes. And you believed her. I was 29 and terrified. I thought I was. Being practical, securing our future. I convinced myself that someday, when I was powerful enough, I could have both the empire and the love. I was going to come back for you, but you never did. By the time I realized what I'd lost, you were gone. You'd moved away, started over. I hired investigators, but you'd vanished completely. I thought you hated me. James opened his eyes, studying. Her face with the intensity of a man seeing clearly for the first time in years. I did hate you. For about 6 months. Then I met Sarah, and she taught me that some people leave your life to make room for others. She said maybe you weren't my forever love. Maybe you were just my first love, teaching me how to recognize the real thing when it arrived. The words should have stung, but Catherine found them oddly comforting. Sarah had been worthy of James's love in ways that Catherine had never allowed herself to be. She sounds like an extraordinary woman. She was. And she would have loved Grace. Fiercely, just like I do. Which is why I have to get to her, Catherine. That little girl has lost everyone except me. I can't let her think I've abandoned her, too. Catherine stood up abruptly, her mind racing with possibilities and consequences. What if I could get her back? What if I could fix this? At what cost? Your family's already declared war. Are you prepared to lose everything again? Catherine looked at James broken, beautiful, fighting cancer and heartbreak with equal determination, and finally understood what she should have realized 10 years ago. I already lost everything that mattered once, she said quietly. I'm not making that mistake again. The machines around James's bed beeped steadily as she leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to his forehead. Rest. I'm going to bring our daughter home. Catherine's heels echoed through the sterile corridors of the Williams Tower for what might be the last time as its owner. The emergency board meeting was already in session when she arrived. 23 faces turned toward her with expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed ambition. Victoria sat at the head of the conference table like a queen holding court, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. Robert flanked her right side, a folder of documents spread before him like ammunition. Catherine, dear, Victoria's voice dripped false sympathy, we're all so concerned about your recent episodes, the unauthorized charitable donations, the emotional instability, the poor judgment regarding unsuitable companions. Where is Grace Parker? Catherine demanded, ignoring the board members' confused murmurs. Safe, Robert replied smoothly. In a lovely foster home with people equipped to handle traumatized children. Far from the toxic environment you created. Catherine's phone buzzed with a text from her private investigator. Grace placed with the Morrison family. 847 Elm Street. Child is reportedly inconsolable. The image of Grace, crying for her father in a stranger's house, nearly brought Catherine to her knees. But she forced herself to remain standing. 23 board members watched her like vultures sensing weakness. Here's what's going to happen, Catherine announced, her voice carrying the steel that had built her empire. I'm calling an emergency vote of no confidence in the current board structure. As majority shareholder, I'm exercising my right to dissolve this board and reconstitute it with members who understand that true leadership requires more than quarterly profits. Victoria's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. My dear, you seem confused about your position. Here, Robert, would you please enlighten our Catherine about her current status? Robert stood with theatrical precision, opening his folder to reveal legal documents that made Catherine's blood turn to ice. Per Article 47 of the Williams Trust, any beneficiary deemed mentally unfit to manage corporate assets will have their voting rights suspended pending psychiatric evaluation. You had me declared mentally incompetent? Not yet, Victoria smiled. Like a predator. But Dr. Whitmore is prepared to testify about your recent erratic behavior. The unauthorized hospital payments, the emotional breakdown witnessed by multiple employees, the obsessive focus on a man who nearly destroyed you once. Before. Catherine scanned the faces around the table, people she'd worked with for years, whose careers she'd advanced, whose families she'd enriched through company profits. Not one of them met her eyes. However, Victoria continued, there is a path forward. Sign these documents transferring your shares to a family trust managed by Robert and myself. Publicly announce that your recent actions were the result of temporary stress-related illness. Cut all ties with James Parker and his ward. Do this, and you retain your position as a figurehead CEO with a generous salary. And if I refuse? Then, by 5 o'clock today, he'll be declared mentally incompetent, stripped of all assets, and committed for psychiatric observation. Grace Parker will remain in foster care indefinitely, and James Parker will lose his medical coverage the moment. You're no longer able to authorize payments. The trap was perfect in its cruelty. Victoria had orchestrated a scenario where Catherine's love for James and Grace became the weapon used to destroy them all. Catherine's phone buzzed again. A message from the hospital. Mr. Parker's condition deteriorating. Requesting immediate family conference regarding treatment options. The irony was suffocating. James was dying while she sat in a boardroom fighting for the right to save him. Grace was crying for her father in a stranger's house while Catherine's own family used the child's love as leverage. For 40 years, Catherine had played by Victoria's rules, believing that power and wealth would eventually buy her everything she wanted. Now she understood that some things couldn't be purchased. They could only be chosen. I need 1 hour, Catherine said quietly. You have 30 minutes, Victoria replied. Not a second longer. Catherine walked to the window overlooking Manhattan, the city that had shaped her into a queen of commerce and a failure at love. Somewhere in those gleaming towers, Grace was learning that adults could be cruel and arbitrary. Somewhere in a hospital bed, James was fighting for his life while wondering if he'd ever see his daughter again. The choice that would define her soul waited for her signature on Victoria's documents. But Catherine Williams had one last card too. Catherine stood at the window of the 42nd floor, Manhattan sprawling beneath her like a kingdom she was about to abdicate. Behind her, the board members whispered among themselves, while Victoria checked her watch with theatrical precision. 20 minutes, Catherine, her mother announced. The psychiatric evaluator is already en route. Catherine pulled out her phone and dialed a number she hadn't called in years. Marcus, I need you to execute the Lazarus protocol. Yes, I'm certain. Do it now. Victoria's face paled. What is the Lazarus protocol? Catherine turned from the window, her expression serene for the first time in decades. Something I set up. Years ago, Mother. A dead man's switch that you never knew existed. Across the city, Marcus Chon sat in his law office executing the most extraordinary legal maneuver of his 30-year career. With a series of keystrokes, he activated documents that Catherine had drafted 5 years earlier during a moment of clarity about her family's true nature. The Lazarus Protocol, Catherine explained to the increasingly agitated board, transfers 100% of my Williams Corporation shares to a charitable foundation I established in secret, the Catherine Williams Foundation for Families. In crisis, as of this moment, I own nothing, which means you can't take anything from me. Robert shot to his feet. That's impossible. We would have known. You would have known if he'd bothered to read the fine print in the trust documents instead of just scheming to steal them. Catherine's smile was radiant. The foundation is administered by an independent board of directors. My role is strictly advisory, with no financial authority whatsoever. Victoria's mask of control finally cracked. You've destroyed everything. 40 years of building this empire. I've transformed it into something that matters. The foundations. First initiative will be funding pediatric cancer research and treatment for families who can't afford care, starting with a $3 million grant to St. Mary's Hospital. Catherine's phone buzzed with confirmation messages as the legal transfers completed themselves across the city. Grace Parker is being returned to her father as we speak. The CPS case has been withdrawn due to lack of evidence, apparently. The anonymous complaints came from a source with clear financial motivations to separate the family. "This is insanity," Robert shouted. "You've made yourself a pauper." Catherine walked toward the conference room door, pausing only to collect her personal items from the desk she'd occupied for 15 years. "I've made myself free." "A difference. Where will you go?" Victoria's voice carried a note of panic. "What will you do?" "You have no money, no home, no prospects." "I have something I never had when I was rich," Catherine replied, her hand on the door handle. "I have hope." As she walked through the corridors of Williams Tower for the last time, Catherine felt lighter with each step. Her Louboutin heels had been replaced with comfortable flats. Her Armani suit would give way to simple clothes that Grace could hug without worrying about wrinkles. The empire was gone, but the kingdom she was walking toward, a hospital room, where love waited for her return, was worth more than all the gold in Manhattan. Her phone rang as she reached the elevator. James's voice was weak, but filled with wonder. "Catherine, Grace is here. She's here, and she's safe, and she's asking for you. Can you come home?" For the first time in 40 years, Catherine Williams knew exactly where home was. The modest 2-bedroom apartment Catherine rented 3 blocks from St. Mary's Hospital couldn't have been more different from her Manhattan penthouse. Second-hand furniture replaced Italian marble, and the view was of a small playground instead of the city skyline. But when Grace's laughter echoed through the rooms, it felt more like home than any palace ever had. "You're burning the pancakes again," James observed gently, his arm wrapped around Catherine's waist as she stood at the stove. 2 months of proper treatment had restored color to his cheeks and strength to his voice, though he still tired easily. "I'm creating a new culinary experience," Catherine replied with mock dignity, flipping a decidedly crispy pancake. "I call it's Charcoal Delight." Grace giggled from her perch at the kitchen table, where she was carefully arranging toy dishes for her stuffed animal's breakfast party. "It's okay, Catherine. Daddy burned dinner every night for the first month after Mommy died. We got really good at ordering pizza." The easy way Grace had begun calling her Catherine instead of Mrs. Williams still made Catherine's heart flutter. She'd never expected to feel maternal instincts at 40, but watching Grace navigate homework or listening to her chatter about school friends filled Catherine with a fierce protectiveness she'd never experienced. "I have good news," James announced, setting down his coffee cup with hands that no longer trembled. "Dr. Martinez called this morning. The latest scans show no sign of cancer recurrence. I'm officially in remission." Catherine's spatula clattered to the floor as she turned to embrace him, tears streaming down her face. Grace cheered and performed a spontaneous victory dance around the kitchen table, her stuffed animals bouncing in celebration. "Does this mean no more hospitals?" Grace asked hopefully. "Just regular checkups," James assured her. "And I'll be strong enough to teach you to ride a bike again. I found a used one at the thrift store yesterday." Catherine wiped her eyes, marveling at how joy felt so much more intense when shared with people you loved. The financial security she'd once craved paled in comparison to these simple moments of connection. "Speaking of good news," Catherine said, pulling an envelope from the counter, "the foundation received its first major donation yesterday. An anonymous benefactor contributed $5 million specifically for family support services." James raised an eyebrow. "Anonymous?" "Completely anonymous," Catherine replied innocently, "though I suspect it might be someone who understands the importance of second chances." The truth was that several former board members, disgusted by Victoria's machinations, had quietly transferred their personal wealth to Catherine's foundation. Even in corporate America, there were people who recognized genuine transformation when they saw it. "I love our new life," Grace declared, setting places for her stuffed animals with serious concentration. "We're like a real family now. Daddy's getting better. Catherine makes terrible pancakes, but excellent hot chocolate." And nobody yells anymore. James caught Catherine's eye over Grace's head, his expression tender with understanding. They both knew this peaceful interlude was a gift time to heal old wounds and build new foundations before facing whatever challenges lay ahead. "What are you thinking about?" James asked softly. Catherine looked around their modest kitchen, at Grace's art projects covering the refrigerator, at the man whose love had survived a decade of separation, and felt something she'd forgotten existed: contentment. "I'm thinking," she said slowly, "that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what you actually need." 6 months had transformed their little apartment into something Catherine never thought possible: a home filled with laughter, arguments over whose turn it was to do dishes, and the comfortable chaos of people who genuinely cared for each other. James had returned to work part-time as a counselor for families facing medical crises, his own experience giving him unique insight into their struggles. Catherine discovered she had a talent for grant writing and fundraising, skills that translated surprisingly well from corporate negotiations to charitable endeavors. "Catherine, can you braid my hair for the school play?" Grace called from the bathroom, her voice echoing off the tiles. She was playing an angel in the Christmas pageant, a role that seemed perfectly suited to the child who had brought salvation to 2 broken adults. "Of course, sweetheart," Catherine replied, setting aside the foundation paperwork she'd been reviewing. Learning to braid hair had been just one of many skills she'd acquired in her new life, along with reading bedtime stories, helping with homework, and kissing scraped knees. James appeared in the doorway, his expression soft with an emotion Catherine was still learning to recognize. "Peace." Dr. Martinez called. "My 6-month scans are completely clear. He's moving me to annual checkups." Catherine felt her knees go weak with relief. 6 months ago, they'd been fighting for James's life. Now they were planning Grace's 8th birthday party and discussing summer vacation possibilities. "Does this mean we can get a dog now?" Grace asked hopefully, her head tilted as Catherine worked on her intricate braid. "We'll see," James and Catherine said simultaneously, then looked at each other and laughed. The evening routine had become sacred dinner around their small table. Grace's animated recounting of her school day, homework supervised by whichever adult was less likely to get frustrated with math problems. Tonight, as Catherine tucked Grace into bed, the little girl looked up with the serious expression she wore when processing important thoughts. "Catherine, are you going to stay with us forever?" The question Catherine had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. "Would you like me to stay forever?" "Yes, but only if you want to. Daddy says love can't be forced. It has to be chosen every day." Catherine smoothed Grace's hair, marveling at the wisdom contained in such a small person. "Then yes, I choose to stay. Every day I choose to stay." As she turned off Grace's bedside lamp, Catherine found James waiting in the hallway, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you," he whispered, pulling her into his arms. "For what?" "For choosing us, for choosing love, for proving that it's never too late for second chances." Catherine nestled against his chest, listening to the steady heartbeat that had nearly stopped forever. Outside their window, snow began to fall again, but this time it looked like blessing instead of burden. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were simply a family, whole and healing and home. 1 year later, St. Mary's Hospital Chapel was decorated with simple white flowers and filled with the soft murmur of intimate conversation. Catherine stood before the mirror in the small bridal room, adjusting the modest cream dress she'd chosen, elegant but unpretentious, perfect for a woman who'd learned that true beauty came from within. "You look beautiful," Grace whispered, carefully arranging Catherine's simple veil. At 8 years old, she took her role as maid of honor very seriously, having spent weeks planning every detail of what she called the most important wedding in the history of the world. Through the chapel doors, Catherine could see James waiting at the altar, handsome in his navy suit, his face radiant with health and happiness. Dr. Martinez sat in the front, row alongside nurses who had become family during those terrifying early days. Even Marcus Chun had flown in from California, tears already streaming down his face. "Are you nervous?" Grace asked, straightening Catherine's bouquet of Daisy's simple flowers that somehow seemed more meaningful than the exotic orchids Catherine had once preferred. "Not nervous," Catherine replied truthfully. Grateful. The past year had been a journey of discovery. Catherine's foundation had grown beyond her wildest dreams, helping hundreds of families navigate medical crisis. She'd learned to measure success, not in profit margins, but in children reunited with healthy parents, in families kept together during their darkest hours. James had recovered completely, his oncologist calling him a medical miracle. Catherine knew the real miracle was simpler. Love had proven stronger than disease, stronger than family disapproval, stronger than the fear that had once ruled her life. "It's time," Grace announced solemnly, taking Catherine's hand. They walked down the aisle together, the woman who'd spent 40 years building walls around her heart and the child who taught her to tear them down. James's eyes filled with tears as they approached, and when Grace ceremoniously placed Catherine's hand in his, she whispered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Take good care of each other, okay? You're the best family ever." The ceremony was brief but profound. When James spoke his vows, his voice carried the weight of second chances and hard-won wisdom. "Catherine, you chose love over empire, hope over fear, us over everything else that seemed important. I promise to spend every day proving that choice was worth making." Catherine's own vows were simpler. "I lost myself building a kingdom of gold and glass. You and Grace helped me find something infinitely more valuable, a home built on love." 3 years later, the family of 3 had become something Catherine never expected, genuinely happy. Grace, now 11, announced regularly that she wanted to run a foundation, just like Catherine when she grew up. James had returned to school part-time, pursuing his master's degree in family counseling. Catherine stood in their garden one evening, watching James teach Grace to plant tomatoes while their rescue dog Buddy supervised with enthusiasm. The modest house they'd bought was nothing like her old penthouse, but it overflowed with the kind of wealth that couldn't be measured in dollars. Her phone rang a call